Welcome to the Emerging Biotech Leader, where we help biotech leaders maximize the value of their therapeutics from translational development to product launch. We're your hosts. I'm Kim Kushner.
And I'm Ramin Farhood. We are here to help you navigate the pitfalls of the biotech industry and illuminate the path forward.
Welcome to today's episode of the Emerging Biotech Leader. Today, I'm so glad to welcome Dr. Chantal van Gils, one of the leads of our evidence and value practice here at SSI Strategy. We're going to be talking about some of the reflections we had from our prior episode with Christian Howell from Cognito. And he talked about a lot of really fascinating points about Alzheimer's and neurotech and development. But three key themes really stood out that Chantal and I wanted to talk about today. First being about the evidentiary burden for medical devices versus pharmaceuticals, broadly about patient-focused drug development and how critical that is and what it really means in the industry. And lastly, how to start to talk to investors on the board about really gaining the budget to invest in real-world evidence. So Chantal, so excited to have you here. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. To start out the conversation, I'd love to start with that first topic, which is really around evidentiary burden. I know this is something that you talk about quite a bit with clients of all types, and really when and where we're thinking about the basis of the evidence required to really bring a drug to market. So maybe we can start with a conversation there. If you can talk me through your thinking around when and how we have to start really investing in not just the minimum viable data to progress an asset for approval.
Absolutely. And I thought, just as a first point, I really thought that session with Christian was really great. It was a really good session. And he spoke very passionate about his journey in the medical device industry. And we have a lot of, we do a lot of, there's a lot happening in the medical device industry, but also in the drug development world, right? And there are quite some differences in strategy and approach. And on the other hand, it's quite converging these days. So ultimately, what you see is that historically, evidentiary requirements for drugs were much higher and much structured than for medical devices. And now what you see is that at least some good solid companies are really taking medical device evidence generation to the next level and really push for high quality evidence generation already very early. And in that light, I mean, we spoke about real world evidence and the role of real world evidence and when would you use real world evidence and how can you use it and I think if I then bridge that to drug development, and you still see randomized controlled trials are the very high standard of evidence in clinical drug development, which is absolutely well understood and well, and I think that shouldn't change. It's just that solid drug development and solid medical device development has to be solid, and RCTs are the base. But the role of real world evidence and the importance of it, you see really that's increasing. And what is important to really consider that really early than the clinical development journey. Basically, it starts with real world evidence. What is the unmet medical need? What is to understand what is the problem that we are facing that we want to solve, and then you have studies, and then it ends with real world evidence where you really can, and that's what Christian was also alluding to, that you can really have an evidence-based, real-world evidence-based marketing and sales, and that you really drive sales through solid evidence, and that's the way how you convince payers and patients, providers, etc.
Absolutely. I think it's a really good point, and the differentiation between pharma and device is one that I want to spend a moment on because Christian made a really great point that the burden for pharma is prior to approval, and for device, at least historically, it's often been after a drug is approved in post-market studies and registries and things that really allow us to build a stronger evidence base over time and really gain the confidence in the use of the device. What he's doing at Cognito is I think, a really great model to consider, which is really pulling that forward and treating the device more like a drug, given its therapeutic effect and what they're trying to demonstrate. But can you maybe give a little bit of insight into why are drugs and device so different? Why have we pushed out the requirements post market for devices, but in pharma and in drugs it's always been prior to approval? How have they even gotten to the point where they're so convergent?
I think it kind of started with risk, right? The risk side of things. And especially when you think about non-invasive devices, it's really different in invasive, right? Where you have high risk. But if in the low risk devices, it's really more about well, if it doesn't harm, let's explore how big the benefits are, and let's explore that in the real world, rather than set up clinical trials which are very expensive, very rigid. The necessity, and also the regulatory bodies were not, demanding that. But yeah, you see, on the one hand, there is a bigger increase in invasive medical devices. So there is and on the other hand, what you see in drug development is that there is a tendency to release innovative drugs to the markets rather earlier than later. It's going up and down, right, in terms of policies and perspectives. But there has been a great trend in accelerated approvals, etc., where there was a high uncertainty when coming to the market, with hence also a high need for further evidence development afterwards. And also, so I think it's shifting both ways, right? The devices are coming up to speed when it comes to pre-authorization evidence development, while in drug development, it has shifted the other way, or not shifted. A little bit shifted, but also in complement. Also, if you look, for example, in oncology, more and more drugs are coming. They're all have a good benefit risk, but what is the optimal combination? How should you use it in real world practice? So I think it is going in both directions. So I think the worlds are converging ultimately.
Absolutely. It's a really great point. And one of the things that I really appreciated that Christian's brought up, and I know you and I have chatted about offline quite a bit, is the idea that by converging these worlds, we're really putting the patient at the center of everything that we're thinking about, from the drug development process or the device development process. It's saying, how do we make sure that this product or this asset is helping the patient first and foremost, and the things the patient cares most about? And in some circumstances, that might be a cure, that might be improved quality of life. There's going to be all of these other variables that may or may not be your primary endpoints in your clinical trials. And so maybe we can spend a moment here just thinking about, what does patient-focused drug development mean, and how do we complement a traditional drug development cycle with real-world evidence and other evidence creation mechanisms in order to put the patient front and center? What does that look like to you?
Well, to me, it's so critical, right? I mean, ultimately, I think the goal of everyone is be meaningful to patients, right? It's not, and I think, and I think there's been like a belief, or maybe in some cases it was the case with big blockbusters, that if you serve, that you could have commercial goals and then more nicer things that you really want to focus on the patient. But I think these days, and if you see where also the US is going, where Europe is going more and more, is that I think patients are at the heart also of commercial drug success. If you keep the patient at the center, and you really focus on bringing something that patients really need and want, and this definitely has a great connection, I think, with also more patients empowerment and patients and empowering patients to, they have a higher voice these days, and they are more heard of what they think is important, and even payers and regulators are more considering these patients' perspective in their decision making. So I think it's a great. It should have been always like that. I think there were incentives for manufacturers to go into a slightly different direction, and now I feel that payers and regulators, as well as providers, are more focusing on, okay, what does the patient need, and implement that in their decision making. And ultimately, if you do that, if you want to do a patient, if you want to put the patient at the center of your decision making, and you then ultimately, it's the next question is, well, how do we measure that? Do we measure that by a biomarker that is testing blood pressure, or blood test, whatever? No, what does it mean to the patient? And I think there it's really important to consider, also, if you want to differentiate from other drugs available, or competition in general, you need to think, where can I make that difference for patients, and then where is that, but also how can I make that visible? And that's by using innovative outcome measures that are more patient centric. And there you see, well, there's a lot of movement going, a lot of still explorative. It's getting more. I think it's still a great area, and I think 10 years from now we will be in a different place from where we are today. But at least if you see where we are today compared to 10 years ago, I think that's an amazing change. And to that point, patient-centered drug development doesn't start at your phase 3 when you become quite focused on what regulators and payers want to see, and what and the medical world out there, commercial world out there. It's really important to start considering these things already in a very early stage when you are developing your TPP, for example, and at that point, it's the tendency can be to focus on those biomarkers that you are expecting to plan for in your phase 1, for example. But I think more and more, and that's what we are advocating, think about the patient relevant outcomes, because sometimes you need to develop them. And if you need to develop them, if you think I need to pressure test them, you rather will want to do that in your phase 1 and 2, and then go with a solid plan, a bulletproof plan into your phase 3. So if you want the exploration phase and development phase for the perfect PRO, the perfect outcome is in your early development.
I think I would assume most of our listeners and people in a position of decision making in early biotechs want to do everything you just said, at least in theory. It's certainly kind of the ideal path. We absolutely want to put patients at the front and foremost of everything that we're doing. What would you see as the starting point? So assuming, as everybody is feeling right now, budgets are limited, time is limited, acceleration is key. What is the easiest starting point to, build on the evidence base, to put patients forward? Is it a patient advisory board? Is it a patient preference study? Where do we start?
Well, that's an interesting question, Kim, because it depends, right? It depends, and it really is very connected to what is the problem at hand, what is the unmet medical need that we are looking at. So it's really so. It really connects to where is the problem? The unmet medical need. That's where it starts, actually. What is the unmet medical need? What is the problem the patient is facing, and how can you quantify that problem? And if you know how to quantify the problem, you also know what do I need in order to quantify that problem, and how to solve it, basically. So it's not sometimes it's very established. The PROs are there, you just need to take them. Sometimes you have to start from scratch, basically.
Maybe to build on that question a little bit is not just where to start, but then how do we start to how do we convince investors? How do we convince the board? One thing I'm always so impressed by Christian and his work at Cognito is he's really convinced everyone around him that while this is a device, we need to do this work now. And I'm confident that they're going to see, great results as a result of all of his early efforts. But it's hard to convince folks to make those investments early. So, I love your perspective or your experiences in making the case for an investor on why now. why, when dollars are so limited, why should they spend the few they have on real world evidence and some of this early efforts?
Yeah, and I think investors are um, mainly interested in return on investment ultimately, right? So I think it's all about drug development with the end in mind. So I think you need to picture how you really need to be able to articulate, let's say that, to articulate how this development is going to lead to a commercial viability and a meaningful product to patients. And I think if you can articulate that key importance and then kind of calculate backwards and saying, well, this because ultimately, if you invest, for example, properly in initial real-world evidence to understand perfectly where you need to be in your where you need to go, you can also de-risk your strategy, right? You can de-risk your drug development. So I think the extra investment needs to be balanced against the de-risking of your science, basically. And I think that connection, I think we should become better in making that connection and articulating that connection, because um, that's the only way, I think, to get the money in, to make sure that we need to make sure it's a limited amount of resources available. And there's one other aspect I've just realized is that the earlier you start considering these aspects, the most efficient you can do that. If it becomes like a natural, it's not necessarily doing 5 extra studies. It's more like in the studies you are already planning, and to add a piece here and there, to add some expertise to think things through, but not necessarily to invest a whole different layer. It's also a different way of thinking in the beginning, and I think. Honestly, I think what is very fascinating to me, if Christian was able in a medical device space to articulate this to his investors and to really, with a non-invasive device, be able to get resources and budget to develop a solid, very solid pre-authorization evidence that you may question, is this really necessary? And the reason is because it will, this kind of investments will play out later in terms of solid evidence, and solid evidence is worth a solid price, is worth a solid. So I think, and it will convince the patient and the provider and physicians that it's really a solid product. So solid evidence lead also to solid proposition, value proposition. So I think that ultimately these dots um, can need to be connected and can be connected. It's about communication.
Yeah, I completely agree. And what I've also been reflecting on with regard to real world evidence is that there's not really a one size fits all. It's not that everybody needs to have a really intense real world evidence strategy. But if we think about disease states like Alzheimer's, where there's so much we know and so much we really don't know and we don't understand, and there's so much research going into the space, the question is, how do we create enough evidence to truly differentiate what we're doing and differentiate safety, effectiveness, how it's applied in different patient populations? Alzheimer's and a lot of these neurodegenerative diseases, I think, are a really great use case for where real world evidence can make a big difference. The other area that I know we've seen a lot of organizations spend a lot of effort on building great cases are when it's a highly competitive disease state. And so, there's 10 developers in the market right now. Everyone's looking for a slice of the pie and hoping that they can really do something different and better for patients. But the core development process probably isn't going to differentiate the asset quite enough for payers to get on board, or for patients to really acknowledge their difference, or when we think about medical affairs to apply, how are we going to tell the story to physicians so that they understand how to best differentiate which patient is going to be better on drug X versus Y. And so real world evidence becomes such a critical component very early, so that differentiation is even possible in a later development, where that's really going to be the key for commercial success.
Absolutely. And I really well, again, back to Christian, because I thought what he said what was really amazing as well is that he said that, if you look at the Alzheimer's space, for example, there's a huge unmet need. I mean, no one questions that. So there is not a lot available, but then still it takes a very collaborative approach, where you would collaborate with the FDA as well as the research, or like the neurological societies, as well as pharma companies and medical device companies, to really kind of connect the dots, work together, say, okay, what problem is the most important problem? What outcomes do we all feel is most important that we really want to improve upon? And how can we help each other to get the best piece of evidence so that we know how to best treat our patients? And it's not something that one company should do in isolation or in competition. It's actually together, solving a huge problem. And he said that don't be afraid of seeking those collaborations. Don't, be transparent, and open, and seek those collaborations without hesitance, because ultimately that's how you improve patient care.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And that ultimately is the goal of what we're all trying to do, is to bring better products to patients, cure or support the diseases that they're working on, put the patients in the center of drug development, and make sure that we're getting drugs to market as quickly as possible, and making sure that they're paid for. Chantal, thank you so much for joining the show today and for talking through really the foundation of what real world evidence can and should be in the process, and really looking forward to seeing what Cognito can do with all of this. So thanks for your time.
Thanks, Kim. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for tuning in to the Emerging Biotech Leader, an SSI Strategy podcast. Join us each month for more conversations with biotech leaders. If you'd like to help navigating the complexities of biotech, reach out to our team at ssistrategy.com. Don't forget to hit subscribe and leave a review.